Good morning, everybody. It is Rollie, and welcome back to another Chatting with Wisdom. Chatting with Wisdom is all about being able to connect and bringing women together and being able to empower them. And so today we're going to be talking about co-sleeping with Kate Stark. And so Kate is a CalmFamily consultant. She has worked with families for the last 6 years, helping them find calmer, compassionate, and connected lives. She specializes in working with babies and toddlers, working with the whole family so that they can find the solutions that work for them. So welcome. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
So this is great. So you're coming to us from the UK, I believe, right?
I am, yes. Yeah.
Nice. So that is pretty awesome. And so tell me a little bit more about you.
So I am a mum. I have a now 6-year-old, and I don't know how he got to 6, but yeah, I have a 6-year-old. I live in Yorkshire in the UK with my husband and son, and I work for myself. Previous to that, I've worked for the National Trust, which is a charity working on landscapes and houses, and had a very potted history of jobs. So kind of fell into supporting parents through my own journey, and because I was getting asked a lot of questions. So I was like, I know the answers to that. I can help there.
Beautiful. It really does help put things into perspective when we have our own children, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And the number of parenting books written by people who don't have children is actually amazing. Some like Gina Ford didn't have children when she wrote her book. I don't know if she does now, but she certainly didn't when she first wrote it. So one of the people in the world who is thought of as being the kind of the person to hold up on a pedestal and say, this is how you parent. And she wasn't a parent at the time.
So, and it really does, because there's no manual to being able to
No.
raise your children. And knowing and having had 2 children, I know how different from one child to the next is, and the differences and the challenges from one child to the next. So like it's pretty interesting. So tell me a little bit more about co-sleeping. So for people who don't know what co-sleeping is, how about we start with that?
So co-sleeping is sleeping on the same surface as your child. So most medical recommendations around the world is pretty much that you should be in the same room as your child for at least 6 months. But co-sleeping is where they are on the same surface as you. So whether that be on the floor, on a floor bed, a lot of people who co-sleep, they might just put a mattress on the floor in the baby's room, and they sleep in the baby's room with them. In my case, we slept in our bed. So he came in our bed with me. And there are a lot of things you can do to make it safer. But it is basically the principle of co-sleeping is that you are sleeping on the same surface.
So I know, I'm not sure in the UK, but I know in Canada, and again, I'm not sure in the US either, but in Canada, I know that it's not always recommended for co-sleeping for safety reasons, for that particular reason. So, what are some of the things that can be done to be able to help provide safety around co-sleeping?
So some of it is knowing the risk factors. So for me, parenting is all about making risk assessments. So every day with a newborn, you're making assessments about what it's safe and not safe to do. And so the first thing you can do is eliminate some of the risk. So some of those risks can be about risk factors. So if you are breastfeeding, then or if you're not breastfeeding, that adds to the risk. If you're breastfeeding, it is less of a risk. If you're on any medication, or if you're drinking alcohol, both of those would add to the risk because they add to your sluggishness. So anything that's going to make you less likely to respond to your child is going to affect that safety. Also smokers, because that's to do with the lungs and getting the oxygen in, and taking away some of the risk factors are things you can just take away. So babies don't use pillows, so they don't sleep on a pillow. So they can't have duvets. So you need to make sure that they still only have access to the area that they are the cushion, the covers that they can breathe through, so that if they get their heads underneath them, they can still breathe through them. It's recommended, if you have long hair like me, that you tie it back when you're asleep so that they don't get caught in your hair. And it's recommended that you use something, you keep them in the middle of the bed. So you sleep on one side, and then there's them, and then there's plenty of space on the other side, with possibly a bed guard on the far side. So you should never sleep with them between two adults. So they are always on there's not two adults next to them, if that makes sense. Yeah. So they're the kind of risk factors that you can eliminate really, really quickly. And then there's also risk factors around the bed itself, not being too soft. So if you sleep on a really, really soft bed, and I'm sure there's something you can do with a melon. To give you an idea, you take a melon, put the melon on your bed, and if the melon sinks, then the child will sink. And it's about that. So it's the same when you are using if you do baby wearing and you're told that baby's got to be close enough to kiss. It's all about making sure that this part of the nose to the lips can't get squashed. So breast tissue is really soft. Bedding is really soft, and what can happen if you have too much bedding or too much soft tissue is that the baby's face goes into it, and instead of being able to still breathe, because if it's firm surface, it just basically goes from the nose to the mouth. It keeps that gap, which means they can still breathe. If it's soft, it can block that space, and then they can't breathe. There's also a shape that you sleep in, so it's called a C shape, which is basically like your arms up. You're sleeping on your side, your arms up. And anybody who thinks, oh yeah, but I'm going to roll onto my child, you try lying on your side like that and actively try and roll over, and it's quite hard. When you're asleep, something that your body finds hard, it's not going to do. So it's very much about kind of putting those safe aspects in. And then when you start looking at the actual science behind it, it's quite misrepresented within medical professions, because all of the data that they have around co-sleeping deaths, they are not specific to safe co-sleeping. So they've not factored all those risks in. What they've done is they've included you on the sofa breastfeeding your child that just won't sleep and is feeding every half an hour, and they're just feeding, and you don't get any sleep. So you fall asleep with them are attached to you on the sofa, and they fall off the sofa or they fall down the side of the sofa. And then that's when you have the issues. So it isn't all cases of safe co-sleeping. Mm-hmm. And there's some amazing stats as well when you actually start to look into them, around the fact that actually if you take out those because it's not separated, you can't take them out. But even when you look at the stats, I'm just in the UK there was a study done, I think it was about 2016, and it was about basically where deaths are occurring and the percentage, and it worked out that about 50% of deaths were co-sleeping and 50% were not co-sleeping. So actually that already tells you, is it that much of a risk factor if half of them weren't? And if you then add in as well the fact that if you then consider the fact that most of the deaths probably were actually risky situations where people weren't given the support, because there's so much stigma around it. Mm-hmm. There's so much, and especially even within the medical professions, there's so much stigma around it that people don't tell you they're bed sharing. So they hide it. And then instead of finding the support to actually understand and to give them the best choices, instead we put them in the situation where they're desperately trying to stay awake on the sofa or in the chair or in their own bed, but because they can't physically stay awake because they are past the point of exhaustion, they fall asleep and actually are putting their child at much more risk than they would have been had they actually taken co-sleeping and looked at it and looked at safety. So in the UK we have the Lullaby Trust, who did a lot of work. A lot of their work was originally around putting babies down on their back rather than their front, and they made a massive difference. And they have actually got a whole section around safe co-sleeping. And actually more parents are putting their children at risk by using things like sleep pods, which they don't think of as bed sharing, co-sleeping. They think of putting their baby in a pod is safe. I can't roll onto them, they can't roll out. But actually, again, you've still got that risk of suffocation in a sleep pod because the edges are too soft, in the same way as cot bumpers. And again, you think, I'm putting something nice and soft so my baby doesn't crack their head on the sides of the cot. But again, you're increasing your chance of your risks relating into to breathing, which is the fundamental thing that is the biggest cause of death in tiny babies, is breathing. It's not banging their head on a cot side, it's breathing.
Nice. And what did you call it? Lullaby something?
Lullaby Trust.
Lullaby Trust. I'm going to just find that and share that link in the discussion so that other people can find it. So it's lullabytrust.org.uk. If anybody is listening to it on the podcast as opposed to on Facebook or YouTube. So I just put it in the comments, and so that people can actually go and take a look, because that's one of the things that you've shared as being a reliable source. So that might be really helpful for families to be able to go and take a look at it. Even those of us in Canada, and then I know, like I said, I don't know across Canada, but in Ontario, I know that the co-sleeping is definitely not recommended. And but it's also, like you said, I know a lot of families that have co-slept with their children, but they keep it quiet, and so they don't share that. And right, so like I like that point that you've actually made, because that's often the case, is that people just don't share what it is that they've done or how they're doing it. And like, even like you said, the C shape, like, so a lot of people may not even know or understand that that part of things. And so with the two kids that I had, co-sleeping was something that we did do. I didn't know that it wasn't recommended in Ontario at the time. I learned that later when I was working with families in other programs. And so that was one of the things that we did. And so my oldest one was great in terms of nursing. He would, every 4 hours from the time that we left the hospital, he would nurse, he would go right back to sleep again. And then before we even left the hospital, he was sleeping 6 hours through the night. So like, he was such an easy peasy baby. And then along came my second, who he didn't do so well in terms of that sleeping. He needed to eat every hour and a half, 24/7. So by the time that you get nursing done, and then you change them, and then you put them back to bed, you burp them, you change them, you put them back to bed, every hour and a half. And I did that for 6 weeks before I finally put him on formula, because I couldn't do anymore physically. And so it was like, the doctor said, at least make it to 6 weeks. That was the goal, was to make it to 6 weeks. And so co-sleeping with him, I had to, so that I could actually function. So dad would, when we did have him in his bed, dad would go and get him, bring him to me. I would nurse him. Dad would get him up and burp him, and then he would put him back down. on the bed with me. And so, because he would get him up and he would change him, and which was really helpful so that I could try and get some sleep during that 6 weeks. But it's exhausting sometimes to be able to, and then when you still have to get up with another toddler and those kinds of things. And so, and my children slept with me until my husband would say they're going to be with us until like they're 16, and I'm like, no, they'll grow out of it, I promise. And so and so the boys would, and we would always start off in their bed, but then through the night they would come and climb in with us. And so, and it was just what we did. And then when they got a little bit older, but still wanted to be in our room, then we co-slept in the room as opposed into in the bed. So they would actually come and they'd make their own little bed with their blankets. And one would be at the end of my bed and the other one would be on the side of my bed because they were too big to sleep with me, but they would still come into my room and have that safety in my room. And then they just grew out of it. And so, and they both sleep quite fine on their own now. So, right, at 26 and 27, they're all both good to sleep on their own if they need to.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that's a really important point, that co-sleeping is not for every family.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for everyone, both from the risk factors and also just the way that we are. But if we educate people on how to do it safely, give them the information on how to do it safely, they can make a much more informed decision about that instead of being scared into ending up doing it. I mean, for me, my journey was around, I think we went to around 3 weeks, and I was having an absolute nightmare with feeding. He had a tongue tie that got cut around 3 weeks, and he was feeding every half an hour at least. He even up to about 18 months, he was still like feeding every half an hour. And it was actually a breastfeeding group that I went to. And I went to a breastfeeding support group to try and get some support with breastfeeding. And I was saying, oh, this is just so tiring. And I'd been convinced that it was unsafe. And she was like, yes, but you're falling asleep with him there. That's much, much less safe. So she was the one that showed me how to co-sleep and safely. And how to breastfeed whilst in that safe position. So I didn't even have you, because one of the things is if you're waking up every half hour, every hour, which is normal, babies have tiny stomachs. Mm-hmm. And if you're waking up for them regularly, the more movement and the more alertness you need, the harder it is then for you to get back into your sleep cycle. So the less the less movement and the less you need to do, and especially as they start to get a bit bigger, the more sleep you're actually getting. So it was revolutionary because I'd sleep in just pajama bottoms and just like let him. Our house is really warm, which helps, because if you live in quite a cold house, then obviously with the whole not being able to have sheets on them thing, that can be another reason that you don't co-sleep. But I just hanging out, and then when he woke up, he'd almost just find it himself. Even at like 3-4 weeks old, he was quite an active child anyway. He rolled really early, he walked at 9 months old, so he rolled over he could roll over onto his side and back onto his back again quite young. But he used to just like, he'd wake up and I'd just get woken up by him on. He'd have latched himself.
Yeah. And
that's a lot less stressful, a lot less awakening experience, because you're not having to get right, okay, now I've got to sit up, and because he only fed for 5 minutes at a time, I didn't have to burp him, so that helped because he wasn't a reflux baby. But you know, there are so many ways that you can make your life easier, and if you're put in this position where you're told you can't do that, it's too dangerous. And actually, in a lot of cases, especially for breastfeeding women, in a lot of cases it's actually safer to co-sleep than it is to not, because they do feed they can feed so regularly that you just end up exhausted.
Yeah. So, and I really love that that ability of being able to make those sound choices as to what it is that is going on. because like you said, we make those choices anyway, right? So like when I was co-sleeping with my children, I didn't know that it wasn't supposed to be like, that wasn't recommended, but we always made sure that there's no pillows around them, that they had their space, that there was like more than enough space, and that we had that ability of being able to, and again, not knowing that you're not supposed to put between two adults, we just never did, right? So dad would sleep behind me, and then he would sleep, and he, as in both of them were he's, so we would both, like, either or would actually sleep. And so then when we were actually co-sleeping with the infant, then the other would actually go and sleep, because he was actually active and moving. He was 18 months when his brother was born, so he would actually go and lay with dad. So then it would be like nursing with one, and like, so nursing and looking after one, and then dad would have the other on the opposite side, where then there was like safety on both ends, so they were both able to sleep. And so I don't know how we managed in a double bed, but we did. And but
Yeah.
it was, and like I said, and so until they actually got older, and my husband would say, like, seriously, are they ever going to stop sleeping with us? And it's like, I enjoyed that time with them. So like that was time for us to be able to connect. And as they got older, it was like sleep training. So they have to be in their bed to start off. And then when they would get up through the night, then they would just climb in. And even when we made it a rule that you guys can't sleep in mommy's bed anymore, we had my youngest one would say, and I would wake up in the morning, and my youngest would be in our bed, and I'd say, like, you're supposed to be staying in your bed. And he'd say, but mom, I came into the room and you just opened up the covers so that I could climb in. I slept through all that. Right? So it was just habit. It was just like, come on in, climb in.
And the thing is, like, so I think Benjamin was about 4, I think, when he went to transition mostly to sleeping in his own room, but he would still come through. It wasn't uncommon for him to come through at around 2, and it was, you just go, you're just scared because it's easier. And for me, what's the harm? If it's easier for me to stay in my bed and go back to sleep than it is for me to take him back to his room, resettle him, and then get back to sleep, I'm all for the easy life. And I think, like, I don't think when he's 20, he's still going to be coming into my room at 2:00 in the morning. So I'm not going to worry about it. But you know what? If my teenage son comes into my room in the middle of the night because he's had a bad dream or because something's going on in his life, I want to be there for him. I mean, I'm still going to be his parent when he's 18, 20, 30. And actually, I would rather have a relationship where he knows that my bed is a safe place he can come to. It's not uncommon when he has a meltdown and he doesn't want anyone at all, and he's trying to regulate himself, he will curl up in my bed. He'll go to my bed and he'll put the covers under. And there's so much that space has been created as a safe space.
Yeah.
And knowing that he finds that a safe space is just a beautiful thing, because it's helping him to regulate himself. He's only just at the age where self-regulation is even really a proper thing. And one of the safest places he's got is my bed. That's beautiful. And I get there are days when you don't want them in your bed. You know, I understand that. But, you know, it's still beautiful.
And so, and it does, and like you said, it does create that safe space, and it does. And so, and my son would probably be horrified if I mentioned, or by me mentioning, is that he was a teenager at one point. Like, one of my children was a teenager at one point, and there was just like so many things that were going on. And it was like, yeah, I don't need to sleep with my mom. I'm a big boy. Like, because he was a teen, but he came in and I was reading a book, and he came in and he climbed on my bed, and we were just talking, and then he just fell asleep. And so it was like, I wasn't waking him to move him. My husband was working night shift, fortunately, because having a teenage boy in our bed, I don't think that he would be okay with that. But it was, but he slept there. I think it was like till 4 or 5 in the morning. He woke up, and then he was like, oh, I'm in my mom's bed. And so then he got up and went back into his own room. And so then, but it allowed him to be able to just curl up and have that conversation and feel safe to be able to just climb into our bed and have that discussion. And it wasn't a big deal. And I've never made it a big deal, because like that was someplace where they could actually be safe. And then when they did start sleeping on their own, then I would, when they were struggling and they didn't want to because they were too big to climb into my bed, according to them, then we would have that I would just go and climb in with them and just have a conversation, and just until they had fallen back asleep and whatever. And so all those kinds of things. But like I said, how we made it so that it was okay is that they would just come and climb in. They would actually create their own bed. And so my oldest had his bed was formed my youngest one. He would actually take his blankets and pillows in and out, because he had specific blankets and pillows, and everything texture wise was something that he needed. But my other one, he didn't really care. So he had some old blankets and some old pillows. And so that was his bed. And then he'd have his other blankets on top. And so like that was a permanent structure in our room. And so, and it just stayed at the end of our bed, between our bed and our closet. And like my husband would say, are we ever going to be able to get rid of this? Yeah, when he's done and when he's ready, and when he doesn't come back into our room anymore. And I think he was 10 or 11 when he stopped coming. And that was okay. And my youngest one, he was a little longer, but it was never a big deal. And so they always knew that they had that safe place to be able to be. And like I said, they would be horrified and mortified listening to this discussion as adults, I'm sure. But it is what it is. And that's just the way to be able to keep that.
But when they go on to have children themselves, they will probably follow the same thing, in that they will be like, well, I did it till I was whatever age.
Yeah.
It's I think there's a lot of talk around things like, giving them independence. They're not independent if they keep coming to your room. But when a toddler, so not so much with babies, but when the toddler, they go to bed in their bed and then they toddle through to you in the middle of the night, that is them being independent. That is them saying, right, I need a cuddle.
Yeah.
I need to feel the safety of my family. And that is them showing their independence, showing they're actually starting to understand their own needs. If they just stay in their bed and cry and cry and cry, that's not meeting their needs, is it? So no. Parenting is all about meeting the child's needs without killing yourself in the process, basically, isn't it? It's
and it really is. Right. So like we want to make sure that they feel safe and that they feel secure, and making sure that you find ways of being able to do that so that they know that is something that's really helpful. And so being able to teach them how to be able to emotionally regulate is also important. So knowing that they're not being ignored. Like I know that when my kids would be small, my parents would say, my mom in particular would say, oh, you need to just let them cry. No, he's crying because there's a reason. I'm not just going to let him cry. He's crying because there's a reason, and I need to make sure that he knows that he's safe and secure. And so, but like that was how we were raised, right? So it's like, but it was like, that's not what I want to do with my own children, and that's not what I did. And so some people would say, well, that's spoiling them. I disagree. So.
No, I saw something on Facebook about half an hour ago, just before I came on here, that was talking about smacking, which, if you hadn't guessed, I'm against. But it was saying a child's brain doesn't differentiate between your dad slapping you because you've been naughty and you being hit by something dangerous. Your brain goes, I've been hit, especially the very young brains, and it produces cortisol, which too much cortisol in your system has really negative impacts, and it has impacts on how your brain develops, not just on you emotionally, but actually in how your brain develops in the long term. And so to say, oh, well, they can tell the difference between me giving them a slap for this and this. They can't, because the brain doesn't work like that. And it's exactly the same when we talk about ignoring their needs. That when I have a teenage son, do I want him to know that he can come to me with any need, with anything? Of course I do. So why wouldn't I want my baby to be able to communicate that need and know that it was going to be met? And a baby's only recourse to tell you what's wrong is to cry. That is their only real way of communicating with you. Yes, there are lots of cues before crying, but their main communication is crying. So of course, if my baby's crying, I'm going to pick them up. I'm going to meet their needs. I'm going to work out what their needs are. And I don't think I ever questioned that. I think, but there is so much out there, like I say, by the people who maybe aren't even parents, who think that, who don't actually even understand how a baby's brain works. And, you know, your baby's manipulating you. Well, manipulation doesn't come till they're at least 6 or 7. So actually, no, my little boy is only just starting to learn the concept of manipulation, and he doesn't know he's learning that, but that his brain is just starting to make those connections. And babies, toddlers, not a chance. They can't do it. So why are we saying that they are manipulating us? It's just, yeah, I struggle with it.
I'm with you on that. And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of wrap up with is, how do families work with you? So how do they get in touch? How do they work with you?
So I've got, so I'm on Facebook and Instagram as Be Carried. So it's the letter B and then the word carried. I have a podcast called Playing at Parenting, which obviously is another way to follow on what I'm doing. And I run workshops, and I do one-to-one classes with people to work through anything from you found out you're pregnant and you have no idea what having a child is going to be like. So I've got a course called Preparing to Parent. So most of the antenatal classes that you do are all about the birth, really, rather than breastfeeding, bottle feeding, actually holding a child, those kinds of things. But then I go all the way up to 5. So my toddler stuff is up to 5-year-old, because at 5, there's quite a big brain shift. And also at 5 in the UK is when they go to school. So that's kind of fits nicely for us over here. But I do work with people all over the world. My workshops tend to be based around UK time zones, but obviously one-to-ones can be booked with me pretty much. If I'm awake, I can potentially do it. So it's just about scheduling that. So hopefully you can find me quite easily.
Perfect. So what I did was so in the description of wherever it is that you are watching this has all of Kate's contact information, but I did share her Facebook page, and I shared her podcast and in the comment section for Facebook and YouTube. So if you guys want to go and connect with her, then I've made things a little easier. And for those of you who are listening on the podcast, then just go into the description and find her information that way. And so thank you so much, Kate, for joining and sharing your wisdom on co-sleeping. And it was very informative in terms of the risks and what to be able to look for and those kinds of things. And so, and having those conversations with with your parent, and like with your physician and your practitioners. And so like, I know that for me, when I would be talking with my doctor was old school. So my doctor didn't have any issues with the co-sleep. So he was okay with it and would talk about like, okay, well, make sure that you're doing this and make sure you're doing that. And so that's not something that the younger physicians may not necessarily have that same approach, but I know that he was always okay with making sure that we were, because I was honest with my doctor. So I was a very anxious mom and wanted to make sure that that my kids were safe. So I definitely would have conversations, especially with my youngest nursing every hour and a half for 24/7. It was pretty exhausting, and but I also knew the importance of breastfeeding and how important it was for me to be able to continue. And had I have known now what I did, or had I have known then what I know now about the breastfeeding, I would have probably continued beyond the 6 weeks. But even still to this day, he has a high metabolism. So like my youngest still has a high metabolism, and he can eat us out of house and home and still not gain any weight. Like it's just part of his genetic makeup. And so it was just always really helpful. It would have been helpful for me to be able to know some of those things. So thank you again so much, and good luck to all the families who are trying to figure out how to navigate through parenting at these younger stages, and then beyond, because things change, but it's the challenges remain, all depending on your children. So thanks again, and I really truly appreciate you joining us. Bye for now, everybody. I will be back next Wednesday as opposed to Friday for Chatting with Wisdom. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.